Okay, so hello and welcome to this ARMA webinar on Paediatric Rheumatology, Lived Experience and Psychological Needs. My name's Sue Brown and I'm the Chief Executive of the Arthritis and Musculoskeletal Alliance, ARMA. We're an umbrella body that brings together patient and professional groups that work for better health services for people with musculoskeletal conditions. I'm really delighted to be bringing you our first ever webinar about paediatric issues, and we're hoping to have more of these in the future. We've got two speakers today. We have Polly Livermore, who is a rheumatology nurse who's studied the psychological needs of children with juvenile dermatomyositis. And I'm really grateful to you, Polly, for making the time to come and do this today. And we also will have hear from an expert parent, Lynn. So, as I say, we're going to take both presentations first, and then we will take questions afterwards. So thank you very much, and over to you, Polly.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. Let me just see if I can share the slides, and we will check that works. How's that? Okay, so I'm very honoured to be invited to speak to you today, especially in such an important topic area. So mental health and paediatrics are often overlooked generally, and it's something that's really important to me and my area of interest that I work in. I'm also really proud to be presenting this to you today with the help of Lynn, who is an expert parent, who I will introduce more as we come to her bit where she's going to talk to you later on. Claire Deakin, who is an amazing colleague who I work with at Great Ormond Street Hospital, was going to talk to you today about some of the research that's happening, but unfortunately, because of the current crisis that's going on, she can't join us today. But I will present her slides on her behalf as we go through. So what we wanted to talk to you about is give you a bit of an introduction to paediatric rheumatology. As we've heard, the majority of people are online aren't in the paediatric field, so I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction and also talk about some of the research that's happening. I'm going to touch on psychosocial well-being in paediatric rheumatology generally, but then what I'm going to do is take you through a JDM research study that we've been doing and show you how psychosocial needs are so important and how we can improve things in the future. And then Lynn is going to talk, she's kindly offered to talk about a parental perspective and how it's affected her and her daughter and all of her family. And hopefully we'll have time for questions. So normally when you do a PowerPoint presentation, you finish thanking everybody that's been involved, but I want to do it in the beginning, and this is because it's really important. This study wouldn't have happened without the support from absolutely everybody that you can see here and many more that you can't see here. So ARMA in particular for inviting us to give this webinar today and for all the support and hosting it. That's been absolutely amazing. On the left-hand side, you can see two charities there. There's Versus Arthritis and there's Myositis UK. Both of these have been really supportive throughout the whole journey of this study. Myositis UK, they're a charity body that looks after anyone who's got any kind of myositis, so adult myositis, but also juvenile dermatomyositis. So if you're a parent or a young person and you haven't gone and had a look at their website and joined their organisation, then I recommend you do so. Also on the right hand side we have Myositis Association and Cure JM. They're American association charities bodies, again very, very supportive and great resources online if you want to have a look. The JDRG and the JDCBS at the bottom, I will talk on a bit more as we go through the presentation today. And then all of the things at the top right are all of the affiliations that I belong to. So I work at Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, which is part of UCL. I'm a member of the Great Ormond Street Biomedical Research Centre, and on the top left you can see the NIHR logo. The NIHR have given me funding to do this 3-year full-time PhD study, so their logo is on each of the slides. On the far right you can see the ORCID logo. So ORCID is the centre at Great Ormond Street Hospital that supports nurses and allied health professionals to do research right from very first audit ideas all the way through to postdoctoral senior lectureships. And our manager of Orchid, our lead, is Professor Faith Gibson, that you can see here. I'm just to the left of the Orchid sign, and she's been incredibly supportive and helpful for me throughout my whole research journey. And then higher than that, on the top left, is Professor Lucy Wedderburn, who's the paediatric rheumatologist at Great Ormond Street, who's been my primary supervisor and really supported me. But most importantly, I want to thank the children and the young people and the parents and the siblings and the extended family, because without you guys taking time to be interviewed, to fill in questionnaires, to send me some feedback, to read things, to come to workshops and focus groups, this study wouldn't have happened. And I really hope that this study puts back into the community and really helps you guys in the future as we go forward. So just to give you a little bit of context to who I am, at the top right is my Twitter hashtag, but feel free throughout this webinar, especially if it's positive, to add any comments. As Sue said, I'm a nurse by background. I'm a paediatric nurse. I've spent 20 years in rheumatology in a variety of different roles you can see here, from qualifying in '97, becoming a staff nurse, research nurse. I was then a nurse practitioner and went on to become a ward matron, a ward manager and a matron of many different areas. At the bottom there, you can see some of the publications that I've done. I've been involved in many things over the years. This is just a small snapshot, but I've always had an interest in research, always had an interest in rheumatology and how we can improve things for young people going forward. I'm really lucky, as I said, to have been awarded a NIHR Clinical Doctoral Research Fellowship to do my PhD, and my chosen area of interest is psychosocial needs in juvenile dermatomyositis. But before I start, I want to share some words with you. So throughout my project, I have interviewed children and young people, and from their stories, from their words, things they've told me, I've crafted some poems from their exact language. And I want to share one of these with you, and I will come back to it at the end, and hopefully it will become clear why I've used it. Worry. You give me a name that I can't say, but I have to explain what it is every day. I'm 10 now, but I worry about how I will be. What is my JDM doing to me? It's not easy to see, but I know it's there, inside me. So what is paediatric rheumatology? I'm just going to give you a really brief introduction. So it is a clinical discipline that embraces the study of inflammatory and non-inflammatory disorders of the connective tissues in children. So our main bread and butter, the main things we do in paediatric rheumatology for the inflammatory, is juvenile idiopathic arthritis. This is the majority of what we see in specialist centres and in district generals. But there are other things that we see, especially at Great Ormond Street, so juvenile onset lupus, juvenile dermatomyositis, and these rarer vasculitic disorders such as Kawasaki's disease, Wegener's, conditions like that. For the non-inflammatory, there's many of them, but I've just picked two in particular. We see a lot of hypermobility and non-inflammatory musculoskeletal pain, and part of our role is helping children to live with these conditions long-term as they go through their childhood. So juvenile idiopathic arthritis, I've just got one slide on this because, as I've told you, it's the majority of paediatric rheumatology. So it is a rheumatological inflammatory disease, and in some of the different types, it can be multi-system. The incidence is 10 to 20 cases per children per year. So actually it's quite a common condition. It's as common as diabetes is in paediatrics, but a lot less known about. Most people don't know that children can get arthritis. So the presence of chronic arthritis. What is arthritis? So it's inflammation, pain, swelling, stiffness of the joint, as you can see here in this bottom picture, for a minimum of 6 weeks in one or more joints, diagnosed before the age of 16 without any known cause. And it's classified into 7 different subtypes. So you can see here on the pie chart, the top left, it doesn't show our unclassified because it's a very small group, but the majority of what we see is what's called oligo-JIA. So this is typically young girls between around the ages of 2 to 4, often blonde-haired little young girls who get arthritis of 4 or less joints. And often it's very easily managed, and in most of them it goes away. The other conditions you see more on the left-hand side of the pie chart, so the polyrheumatoid factor positives and the systemics, these are conditions that children will have varying disease courses. Systemic can affect many different organs of the body, can cause fevers and rashes in these young people. So there's very variable disease trajectories and what medications these children have depending on what type of condition they have. So moving into juvenile dermatomyositis, and I've shortened it for JDM, you'll see that throughout the slides. So this is a rheumatological multi-system inflammatory disease, and the incidence is 2 to 3 million per year. So you can see the difference already from the JIA. This is a really, really rare condition. And it starts in these young people with skin rashes. So you can see on the montage on the left some different skin rashes here. So you can see the child's hands where she's got, if this pointer works, here, the redness on the knuckles. So these are called Gottron's papules, and young people get these on their knuckles, on their elbows and their knees. And that's why a lot of these young people get misdiagnosed in the beginning. They get told that they have eczema or psoriasis or scarlet fever. The rash can also affect the face, so children get redness around their eyes, called a heliotrope rash, and very red on the cheeks, especially in the beginning. So these children do look quite different. And then these children develop weakness. So the weakness can come on very quickly, or it can come on really slowly. So you might find if it's a younger child, for instance, they start to be asked to be carried more often than they used to be, or they want to go back in the buggy when previously they were getting more mobile and walking more. For school-age children, you often find that they struggle standing up from a chair. They struggle walking up and down stairs, and that's because these are the main muscles, the first muscles to go, the proximal muscles of the legs. Can affect many organs of the body. So it's a muscular disease, so it can affect any muscle. So some children would get interstitial lung disease if they have very bad disease that's not treated very well. And some children have what's called calcinosis. So this is calcium deposits outside of the bone where it should normally be. And you can see some pictures of that on the left. The girl's arm on the top left is obviously infected and very inflamed. And the x-ray at the bottom, you can see the calcium deposits there on the x-ray that have been put inside the subcutaneous tissues and inside the muscles. So one of the ways we diagnose JDM is by doing an MRI, and you can see an MRI scan there. And normally on an MRI, water inflammation appears as white. So you would see whiteness in the muscles where it shouldn't be. And some of the children we see at Great Ormond Street in particular have really severe JDM, so severe that it actually stops them moving. So you think how scary that is for a normal, healthy, fit child, so to suddenly not be able to even scratch their own noses. So it affects more females than males, and the peak age of onset is around 6.5, but it can occur at any age. And 2/3 of our young people that we look after will experience fluctuations of remission and relapse of their JDM as they go through childhood and into adulthood. So Claire was going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that's happening in JDM at the moment. So research on really rare diseases is really, really important, and it really involves close partnership between the clinical and the research teams and people with experience in different areas. Claire's been really lucky that she's doing a genetic study, which is called an analysis of genetic risk factors in JDM. And she's received over 1,000 patient samples from international collaborations, so from centres in America and centres in Europe. And without this really big, close collaboration, which we do really, really well in rheumatology, we wouldn't be able to find answers and do big-scale research projects. We need as many patients as possible to be involved in what's called a cohort study, and that means following patients for a long period of time. And it involves researchers from all around the world to think creatively and work together and find exciting answers about how we can improve things. And again, you can see the charities that have been involved with some of Claire's work. So in the UK, we're super, super lucky that we have this thing called a JDCBS. Don't worry too much about this, but it's basically a database that collects patient data from around the whole of the UK. So at the moment, there's 17 centres in this JDCBS. And what happens is when a patient is diagnosed, they will, when the patient has consented to be involved, they will collect biological data, so blood samples, muscle biopsies, and they will collect clinical data about the child, and that child will be followed up time and time again, so that longitudinally we have a really good database of everyone with JDM in theory in the UK. And it collects all the things that you can see there, and the idea is that we can look for certain factors that are important that come up amongst all of these patients. So one of the things is about looking for biomarkers in the blood to see if we can work out how severity of people's disease. So that's the kind of things we're working on, looking at antibodies. And this just shows you a little bit of the dashboard. For instance, this is of a patient, and this is the front page that the doctor sees, and patients around the UK can also ask to see their own dashboard and see their results here. So there's a graph which shows really nicely this young person that's been plotted over a period of time and the things that we look for. So for example, their pain scores or their muscle scores, or how the doctor thinks they're doing. So all of that is plotted, and it gives a really nice snapshot of how young people are doing, what treatments are working, what side effects are people getting, those kind of things. And what Claire spends a lot of her time doing is collecting blood samples and looking at immune cells to see how they behave differently. In the top right hand picture you can see Lucy Marshall. She's a PhD student at UCL and part of Great Ormond Street, and she's working on JDM samples, looking at all of them and looking for things that are important amongst them all. So what about psychosocial needs? I've told you about some of the physical kind of things that are going on, but what about the emotional things? So when we look at current opinion on psychosocial needs in paediatric rheumatology, there's real contradictory evidence. There's some papers out there that say the majority of children with paediatric rheumatology conditions are coping really nicely and doing absolutely fine and on a par with their peers. But there's also evidence that says they're not doing so well. Most of the evidence is done in juvenile arthritis. As I've said, there's more of these patients out there to collect evidence on. And what a lot of the literature says is that there's greater anxiety and lower health-related quality of life in patients with JIA. And there's many different reports that you can read on that in the literature. But chronic illness in itself may present a greater threat to the young people we look after, which includes our children with juvenile dermatomyositis. A chronic illness is a condition that goes through life that you have for a very long period of time, for months and often years. And we also know that pain negatively affects all aspects of health-related quality of life, and there's a lot of literature on there about pain. When we're looking at possible factors which might impact chronic illness, I thought some of these factors were particularly interesting for us to think about from our own perspective. So a lot of the literature says that gender, so boys are more at a greater risk of having an impaired psychosocial functioning. So the literature says, you might disagree with that. Looking at severity, again, the relationship is unclear. There's some evidence that there's a very much a linear relationship between severity of disease and psychosocial maladaptation. But again, equally, there is some literature out there that says children not only with the severest disease, but those also with mild disease struggle more so than the people that have an intermediate disease in the middle. Visibility is a really big thing, and that came out really clearly in the study, and I'll talk again about it in a little bit. But children who are clearly identified by their disease might be less at risk of getting psychosocial issues. And I think that ambiguity of looking well but not being very well is really hard for young people to kind of cope with, even adults as well, to be honest. There's a lot of diseases in paediatric conditions, epilepsy, for instance, diabetes, where you can't tell someone has a chronic illness, and that has real implications for young people. Looking at prognosis, that's again another big factor. So those conditions that have a poor prognosis or an uncertain prognosis, such as JDM does, to be honest, causes problems in young people. Age of onset, it's also unclear if those that grow up with an illness are actually cope better than those that get an illness later on. So if you are diagnosed at the age of 10 or 12 or 15, but you've had a period of normal growth and development, how does that affect how you manage it when you get your condition? Child characteristics, there's a lot of literature out there that says the higher the IQ and the more positive temperament, the better those children do. And I suppose that's fairly common sense, really, on your outlook on life. If you would approach an exam in a positive mindset, you would probably do better than someone who doesn't necessarily do that. So we can see how that works. And then looking at the family environment, there's lots of things about how the family copes. So parental mental health, the stability and cohesion of family units, how much extended family support there is, and also financial resources are really important when looking at how that young person copes and learns to cope with their illness. Also the medical environment. If you have one physician who coordinates all of your care, generally spends a lot of time talking to that one particular family, gets to know you really well, those children often have better outcomes than those who have a lot of people involved in their care. So I wanted to share with you this report that came out February 18, and this was done by Rare Disease UK, which is a multi-stakeholdered group which is made up of the Genetic Alliance, Rare Disease UK, and SWAN UK, which is Syndromes Without a Name. And they have produced a recent report which was from inviting children with rare or genetic conditions and siblings between the ages of 3 and 17 to attend workshops around the United Kingdom. And they found some really positive results, so I wanted to share this. They found that children affected by rare diseases are adaptive and resilient. They generally do not see their disease as part of their identity, so I thought that was important. But young people affected by rare diseases do have different needs and different challenges compared to children without rare diseases. And they also spend a lot of time talking to siblings, and siblings understand a great deal and develop skills in empathy and compassion, despite facing their own challenges. And siblings are often overlooked in the literature. In this study, for instance, we didn't have the scope to bring siblings in, but it's one thing I would really love to do in the future, because I think siblings do have their own needs which are overlooked. So what about psychosocial needs in JDM? Well, there is very limited literature available out there, and there is no research that asks children and young people themselves with JDM what their experience is, how they cope, and what their needs are. So there's 3 papers that you can see here on the left, and the top one was published in 1990, so over 20 years ago now, and they started talking about mental health and psychosocial functioning in kids with rheumatic conditions, so a long time ago. The 2 recent papers you can see below, the middle one written in 2009, asked parents how their young person coped with JDM, and the one written in 2017 again asked families to complete questionnaires about how their young person was coping, but didn't ask the young person themselves. My personal experience of over 20 years of looking after kids with JDM, I really feel we could be doing more to help young people cope and manage their conditions, and that's why I wanted to do this study. And it's the first really that really captures what young people think and feel, and those are the results I want to share with you today. So looking at our study, what we wanted to do was understand the lived experience and psychosocial needs of children and young people with juvenile dermatomyositis. So this is that lived experience, the experience of those who actually have it. There's no point me asking parents, they'll give me a perspective, definitely, but actually it's the young person, what they think and feel. And psychosocial, so that your psychological part of you is how you think and feel and how you cope, and your social is all the other bits, your home, your school, your friends, what support systems you have in place. So we spend a lot of time in healthcare in that yellow bit of the circle that you can see, managing the physical signs, managing the medications, but actually a lot less time and effort and energy looking at all the other bits which are equally just as important. For this study, our children and young people, our definition is ages 8 to 19, and that was really important. We needed to have a cutoff, and whilst this excludes the younger age range, we needed children to be able to withstand interviews and to cope with them and not cause any ethical problems and be able to complete questionnaires. So our study design, don't worry too much about this, but it's just to give you a bit of an idea what we did. We started on the top right with some in-depth interviews. So this was, we don't know what the problem is, so we needed to ask young people what they thought, what they feel we could improve, and what things they struggle with. So very exploratory with a small group of children and young people. And then we sent some questionnaires around the whole of the UK, and the point of this was to look for what we'd found in the first phase, whether it was important in a bigger group of kids. Maybe the children we'd interviewed had specific factors going on that actually everybody else doesn't think is important. So we were looking at that resonance, and to do that we used the registry that I talked about earlier, so the JDCBS, and you can see there the sites across the whole of the UK. And without these nurses, this bit of the study wouldn't have happened. The local nurses were amazing at helping me do this. And then the surveys. So what we wanted to look at is scope of provision, to find out what is out there to support young people currently. So this survey went to health professionals to ask them what they do at the moment. So phase 1 was to explore what's the lived experience of JDM. And we used a method called phenomenology. So I can tell you what a nightmare it is to have curly hair, how I have to wash it every day and make it curly and look after it and don't go out in frizzy in the rain because it will go frizzy, those kind of things. But I can't tell you what it's like to have JDM because I don't have JDM. So I need to ask the young people themselves to really understand what it's like. And to do this, we did open-ended and unstructured interviews. So it was very much tell me about you. And we added in some creative art methods to help young people talk. We interviewed 15 young people between the ages of 8 to 18 and a really big, wide range of disease durations and severity. And then we analysed it in the standard phenological way, which I will talk a bit about. So the interviews were carried out in clinic, on the ward or at home with these creative methods, and they ranged from 18 minutes to 130, audio taped and transcribed. So the biggest interview we did yielded 26 pages of transcript. And then for an analysis, it's an 8-step process that you do for phenomenology to create that core essence. And the aim was to craft a story to understand that phenomena. So what phenomena did we find? Well, what was really hard was to capture all the various voices. As I said, we've had young people with different diseases, the same disease, but different types of how their disease has affected them. But there were clear moments when life was bleaker for a lot of these young people, and certain things that were really specific. So as I've said, that hard to diagnose, most of these children were misdiagnosed in the beginning, back and forth, time wasted, frustration, people don't believe me, I don't know what's going on, that really hard bit there. The sudden onset, for some of these young kids, their JDM started really suddenly, and that can be really scary. And the fact that it can make these kids unable to move, if something stops you walking, that is something that's not to be taken lightly. The relapsing and remitting journey and the invisibility that I've talked about. And children as young as 10 were telling me that there's no cure for their JDM, and how does that make them feel? But what I really wanted was something that was understandable to everybody. Phenomenology normally comes out with something really complicated and fancy at the end of it, but I wanted something that would help our patients and our families to really understand JDM and their journey. So we came out with being on the JDM roller coaster, and actually you could use this for any ill health. You could use it for anything that you and I are going through day to day. But for JDM particularly, I'm going to walk you through it, and this has been published. You can see the reference has to go at the bottom of each slide for copyright reasons. So in the very beginning of the roller coaster, these young people are going back and forth to their GPs. I don't feel well, I'm getting tired, I'm fatigued, I'm struggling to do things. No one knows what's wrong with me, and that kind of frustration that's there. And then as they get diagnosed, finally, often when they're sent to specialist centres and they get a proper condition, they get a name, they can Google that name, they can tell their family what that name is. There's that bit of someone's believed me, someone's understanding, someone's listening, and that feeling a bit better about it. But then as they go through and they realise that they really are poorly and they really can't move, and how that affects them, about how some of the children at Great Ormond Street need to be in hospital for a long period of time, and how does that affect these young people that we're looking after? The fact that there is no cure and that they might be away from families and friends. The procedures aren't nice we do to these young people, so they often have a muscle biopsy, they might have NG tubes put down to help them feed, they have blood tests taken and lines putting in. But as the medicines and physio start to work, they start to feel a bit better, they might be able to move again. And a lot of them talked a lot about this close relationship with a parent in hospital. And what a lovely thing this was, that they bonded, and that bond, even after they're out of hospital and years down the line, they feel they've had that kind of relationship that wasn't necessarily there to this extent before. But then the young people realise that they need to go through this journey and how it affects them. So a lot of the young people in hospital have to have regular physiotherapy. Think if you're tired and fatigued and you're in pain and you're lying in a hospital bed, you don't want to go and do physio twice a day. How awful this is for these young people that are going through it. And the side effects of the medicines kick in. We use really powerful medicines that do have nasty side effects. And a lot of the young people talked about how it makes them feel sick and how hard it is. This, I look different, I am different. Young people start to realise that actually they've got a chronic condition. And some young people told me all kinds of stories about how they suddenly realised that they were going to have this lifelong, when people started talking about having babies, for instance. It wasn't until that moment that they actually realised that they're living with this condition and will be for years to come. A lot of the young people talked about when they get out of hospital, they had a party, and about how they had their friends and they could get a bit of normality and realise and meet people and how good that was. But this, I feel okay today, I don't feel okay today. And a lot of young people, this can go on for weeks, months, even years. This remitting course, relapsing, remitting, I don't know how I'm going to be when I wake up tomorrow. There's a party at the weekend, I have no idea if I'm going to be able to go or not, and how that affects them. A lot of them, especially the older ones, were talking more about how JDM is very rare, so they feel a bit special, and it has made them more of a caring person. It's part of them now, their JDM, and they just need to live with it and accept it and get on. but a lot of them talked about explaining all the time what JDM is and how that makes them feel. And obviously it's really hard to do that if you don't understand it fully yourself, and about not knowing what my future holds. And that came out time and time again from the interviews. So this roller coaster metaphor is easy for all ages to understand, and it really does capture those ups and downs. You can have plateaus, you can have flat bits for long periods of time, you could go round on it again, and for different people it takes different speeds. But the view is very different from the top down to the bottom up. For a young person who's struggling with the side effects of the medications, with fatigue, tiredness, pain, compared to someone who is going back to school, who is trying to do what their friends can do, it's very different. And that's where health professionals can really help and scaffold for young people to get down the bottom, to get up the top. And it has a positive message for young people that other people have done this before you, and we're going to help you to get through this roller coaster and to get to a place where you want to be. So throughout this, there were distinct themes that came out. So very much this confusion that I've talked about in the beginning, about not knowing what is wrong with them, not just for themselves, but also from their families and from their health professionals that they saw. This feeling different. A lot of young people want to be different, but don't want to be different. And that kind of schizophrenic, I want people to be able to see that I've got a condition so they don't think I'm faking it, but then equally I want to be the same as my friends and do what they're doing. The medications, the sick from the medications, a lot of them that we give, the methotrexate, the cyclophosphamide, can make young people feel really sick. The steroids are nasty drugs in high doses, cause weight gain, cushingoid features, but also that scared. I'm scared about the injections that I've got to have, but I'm scared whether I'm going to be sick in the night tonight. I'm scared about how I'm going to be tomorrow. And that uncertainty, and that really came out. All of the young people talked about uncertainty and their own level of uncertainty and how it affected them. And then this acceptance that I've talked about just, I've got to learn to live with it because that's what I've got. So phase 2 was to look for shared feelings, to look for resonance across the UK, to see if all that stuff I've just told you in the roller coaster was important for other people. So we sent out some questionnaires, and any families or young people online, I'm really, really sorry, it was quite long. It probably, some bits also in hindsight weren't particularly appropriate for everybody. For instance, it asked about medications, but not everyone was on medications. The questionnaires were sent out in the post, but there was also an internet choice of completion, and they were sent to everybody in the registry between the ages of 8 and 19. And as I've said, it was really helpful to have the nurses, who were amazing at really helping me do that. And the idea was to give everybody a say, to say what it's like to have JDM. And there was a lot of open questions in the questionnaire for that. So I won't go into this in detail, but this was our questionnaire pack. It had a bit of demographic data. We collected opinion on quality of life. We had an uncertainty tool, the PIED, which is an emotional distress tool that's often used across the UK. And we also looked at benefit and burden. As you can see here, there were 535 young people in the registry at the time. By the time we'd taken out those that were too young or too old, we ended up with 272, and then some of those we couldn't approach. So there were 246 who were sent postcards telling them about the study, warning them, and also giving them an opt-out in case they didn't want to receive a questionnaire pack. We didn't receive any opt-outs at all, so everyone got a pack, and we had back 127. 4 of those can be excluded, couldn't be used for different reasons. For example, one of them had spilt a drink all over the questionnaire, so we couldn't actually read the answers. So we ended up with 123, which was the 50% response rate. And I'm just going to whiz you through some of the results, really. When we looked at those who responded and those who didn't, we found no difference between gender and age, no difference between years of age when diagnosed or years since diagnosis. So generally those who did and those who didn't were pretty much the same. Looking at those who did reply, we had more females than males. As I've said, it affects more females anyway, so that's understandable. And you can see there the age ranges of those who applied. So we had a really good mix of everybody who spent time to fill in these questionnaires, and that was amazing. When we looked at uncertainty in particular, there were certain things that you can see. So here, there is a group who had higher levels of uncertainty and had higher levels of emotional struggles. Not a very big group, admittedly, but there's definitely a group of young people who are struggling. And don't worry about this table in particular, but what I want to show you is the stuff in yellow. So that's showing us that uncertainty and burden had high correlation. It was statistically significant with lower quality of life and higher emotional distress. So our young people that were saying that their uncertainty were higher were also reporting themselves a lower quality of life and more emotional distress. When we were trying to find out why that might be, we looked at things, age, for instance. Age, there was a slight significance with the older you were, the more likely you were to score on the emotional distress tool. And the longer you had been diagnosed, you were more likely to say your treatments were causing a worse quality of life. But otherwise, we didn't find anything else that was significant to take forward. When we look at the emotional distress, so these across the bottom, you can see the emotional distress score. So 0 on the left is no emotional distress, and 29 on the right is our worst. And you can see the number of patients on the y-axis on the left. This tool comes with it recommendations from the manufacturer, the people who make it, of a cutoff. Children who score over that cutoff need to be referred back to their local team to be offered any further help and support. And all of that happened in the young people. I hope it happened in the young people. They were referred back to their local teams for any extra help. And we actually had 49 of the young people who scored over the cutoff and 74 who didn't. And as I've said, we found the older they were, the more likely, but it wasn't correlated with gender at all. So while we can say that 60% of our patients are doing really well and not reaching cutoff levels, it does mean that 40% of those are. So looking at the emotional distress, 40% scored over the cutoff, 42% were reporting a lower quality of life, and for the uncertainty, nearly 50% of our young people say that they have moderate or high uncertainty from this questionnaire that they completed. We asked the young people, would you like to meet someone else with JDM? And you can see here that 60% of our young people said yes, they would like to, with only just over 10 saying no. And we had many comments added, as you can see here, from this young person. And for those who are joined on the phone, they've ticked yes and put very much so. We also asked young people, do you think you get enough support and help? We had some great positive responses. So here a young person has put yes, and they've named their doctor. Their doctor is a very good consultant, and staff and nurses at my hospital are helpful and friendly. Anything else you want to tell us? I think this is a parent completing this questionnaire, which is absolutely fine. We did ask parents if their young person wanted them to, and they wanted to help. And they've written that JDM makes me feel unique and I'm happy. JDM makes me feel special. So that's really great. That would someone who would fall in that acceptance kind of bit on the roller coaster. But this young person has a slightly different story. What's the worst thing about having JDM? Everything. Anything else you want to tell us? I hate JDM. So when we ask what's the worst thing about having JDM, here I've made a word cloud of what the young people said to us. So limitations due to JDM came out really strongly. So young people have written comments about, for instance, I can't do PE, I can't do what my friends are doing, I can't go on holiday, I can't walk around the town. They really felt the implications because of their JDM. Other things they talked about was feeling sad and the mental health effects, about feeling unhappy that they've got this condition, and the treatment, feeling different, and the uncertainty again. So this is mirroring what we found in our phase 1 from the young people. So then we went to the services and we wanted to know what the services provide. How much support is there out there for these young people? So there was an internet completion. We asked all doctors, nurses and psychologists in the 15 centres to complete some surveys. All of the 15 nurses and doctors replied, so that's absolutely amazing, 100% response rate. However, they could only identify clinical psychologists in 12 of the centres. So this is someone who actually is either a member of the rheumatology team, the paediatric rheumatology team, or someone who might be a trust psychologist, but they give, say, 10% of their time to rheumatology, 10% of their time to oncology or cardiac or any of the other conditions we look after. And out of those 12 that I approached, from names given to me by the main doctors and the nurse specialists, one didn't reply. So I had 11, 92% response rate. And looking at their results, this is just to highlight to you how rare JDM is. So asking the doctors to report how many JDM patients do they have in their centres, you can see the majority with 7 centres have between 10 and 20. So it is a really rare condition, and maybe that affects why psychology isn't necessarily so integrated for these kids with JDM. And so when we asked, do you have a named psychologist? And this is a bit different about who we can approach. 8 of them said, yes, we do have someone that we will go to if we need to. So not necessarily a trust pool of psychology. So only 8 out of the 15 centres. And then we asked the nurses, do you think that some of your patients with JDM have unmet psychosocial needs? And if so, what are they? 10 of these said yes. And one of them wrote body image, disease management, compliance, fatigue, weight gain, and falling behind with education. We asked all of the health professionals, what's the biggest challenge in providing psychosocial care? So our medics replied, long waiting times, big caseloads, lack of psychology in the team or named within the psychology department, patients who live a long distance with poor local care, access to psychology in network clinics. And one doctor said, we don't ask enough about mental health in our patients. There's too much focus during clinic on their physical issues. The nurses said, time, resource. Once they see psychology, they get a good service, but the delay is the problem. Another one said, no rheumatology psychology support and even no trust psychology support. We've campaigned for this over many years without success. And another said, undisturbed time slots with the family. The psychologist said, we have a very large catchment area since we're a specialist centre. Not having dedicated time for rheumatology limits the screening and preemptive early intervention work that can be done. And capacity. Clinical psychologist is very part-time and cannot be present during clinics. One of the consultants kindly sent me an email afterwards, and he's put here that it was a useful survey, and we hope we can use the results to once again push for psychology here to try and make our deaf managers hear. And for me, if we get even a little bit more psychology in one centre, that will be an amazing result from this study. That will be something that hopefully would change someone's life, which is not happening at the moment. And that's where I want this study to be really useful and to really campaign and raise the profile of a psychology need in paediatric rheumatology conditions, but especially JDM. So our phase 4 was to share findings and consider future ideas. How are we going to take this work further forward? So we had a focus group as part of a half-day workshop last September. And we invited anybody who had shown any interest throughout the whole study. So those who received questionnaires were asked to send me their name if they wanted to take part in future work. We also sent out a newsletter of some of the results, and again, young people were asked to take part and send their names through, and just again, in general communication with young people. So we had a workshop that happened in September at the end of last year to discuss ideas for the future, and it was absolutely amazing. We had over 30 people came, which was children and patients and their siblings who took part, young people and parents, and all of you guys added that expert opinion. We also had great charity support. So we had Sally there, you can see on the top right, from Versus Arthritis, and she was absolutely amazing. She brought some volunteers with her. They all took minutes for me. They kept the conversation going. They really, really sparked conversation in these circles that we were in. And Myositis on the top left, Les and Irene came along right down from the South Coast and were absolutely amazing as well. One took part in the young person's group and one in the adult, and they really helped talk about these things. And one of the things we discussed was making a school book for teachers about JDM. There isn't anything worldwide about JDM for teachers. And so we discussed how feasible this would be and what would be the issues. And again, looking at peer mentoring, how could we improve that for young people and get them that support? Would it work for them? What would be the challenges and the difficulties? So just to finish with you, I want to take you back before I pass you on to Lynn, and take you back to the words of the young person I started with. So you give me a name that I can't say, but I have to explain what it is every day. I'm 10 now, but I worry about how I will be. What is my JDM doing to me? It's not easy to see, but I know it's there, inside of me. And so this poem from this young person in just 6 lines encapsulates so much of what came out in my study, about the fact that this young person has to explain time and time and time again. He's a 10-year-old. It's hard enough for us to explain the condition and how it affects people. How does he tell his friends what it is? How does he tell his school teachers and people that he comes across? What about the future for him? He was really clear about how he feels and how JDM is going to affect him. What is it doing to him? It's part of him. He can feel it inside him. We can't see it because it's now turned into an invisible condition, one of these diseases that we can't see. He feels that potentially teachers think he's faking it because nobody can see the fatigue or the pain or the suffering that he's going through. But he carries with him all the time. These kids know that these conditions are proper, serious, big deal conditions. There is no cure, and there is a risk of mortality for these young people. So how do they explain it? How do they cope with it? And I had a lot of doctors tell me that in clinic, they don't talk to the young person because the young person's sitting there very quietly, often staring at the floor or staring at their phone. They direct their questions to the parents. They talk to the parents. But actually, after I had presented this work at a big BSPA conference, some of the doctors came up to me afterwards and said, I'm going to change my practice and really ask the young person, what are they thinking and feeling and how it affects them. If you want to read more of my poems, please feel free, go ahead and have a look at this article that's been published in the Journal of Poetry Therapy. It is open access for everyone. So in conclusion, I would just again like to thank everybody that's been involved. As I've said, there's real obvious limitations. I mean, for instance, obviously missing out those under 8 and siblings. But it is the first piece of research to ask children and young people what it's like, and hopefully it's a stepping stone for the future. If we can secure some further funding, then hopefully some of these ideas can be taken forward. And the rollercoaster has been published as well, so please feel free to look at that. So now I have absolutely great privilege in handing you over to an expert parent, someone who's been incredibly supportive of me in this study, but has also gone through her own journey with her daughter and her family. And she would like to, she's offered really kindly, so I hope you all make her feel really welcome to share her story with you all. And I pass you over to Lynn.
Thanks, Polly. Forgive me, I'm having to read it because I'm a bit nervous. I'm Lynn, and my daughter Gabs has JDM. She was diagnosed 4 years ago when she was 10. In late August 2015, we were on holiday, and Gabs was like any other 10-year-old with no health issues whatsoever. She struggled pulling herself up on the climbing wall, but I didn't think anything of it. She also developed a rash under each eye, bridging over her nose, which I put down to sunburn. By the start of school in September, Gabs was complaining of feeling very tired, and at a swimming lesson, she stopped swimming halfway across the pool because her arms felt too heavy to carry on. That scared me, but I thought it was just tiredness from being back at school. The rash came and went, but I didn't think much of it. 1 week after the swimming incident, Gabs came home and said that she had tried to run during a cross-country PE class and had just fallen to the ground. She was getting more and more exhausted at home and fell a couple of times getting out of the bath. I rang the GP, and over the phone I was told it was a virus. I rang again at the end of the week as Gabs still wasn't getting better, and I was told the same thing, it was a virus and be patient. The following week, Gabs was seen by a GP, and he ordered a blood test and gave us hydrocortisone cream for her rash. 2 days later, he rang me and said that Gabs didn't have leukemia. I didn't even know that they were testing for leukemia. And he said that everything was fine and not to worry. Gabs continued to deteriorate and was seen by various GPs in the practice, with the explanations ranging from growing pains to anxiety. 2 weeks later, Gabs was struggling to walk for 5 minutes to school and couldn't bend her arms to get them into her coat. She also couldn't get her arm up to brush her hair. One night, Gabs couldn't get out of bed, so I started sleeping on her floor. Gabs actually said to me she was fading away. We were referred to a local paediatrician who rang me and saw Gabs within 4 days. As soon as he examined Gabs, he rang Gosh and asked for her to be admitted. On the 26th of October 2015, Gabs was admitted to Gosh. She was diagnosed with JDM within an hour, and we were told that she was seriously ill and that we wouldn't leave the hospital for at least 9 weeks. Gabs and I actually left Gosh the following April 2016, but after that we still went up for 2 days of infusions every month until April 2019. Within 2 days of being admitted, Gabs was in a full wheelchair and had a feeding tube in because she was at risk of choking on her own saliva. She couldn't eat solid food again for over 2 months. Gabs went from being perfectly healthy to being terribly ill within the space of 2 months. Her lungs had started to be affected and she had no control over her body. The hardest part was her complete lack of control over anything. Gabs needed 2 nurses to help her onto a commode. I had to turn her in bed at night and give her bed baths every day. I even had to brush her teeth for her, as she had no strength at all. Gabs developed a terror of cannulas because all of her veins had collapsed, and she would be in a high state of anxiety for several hours, waiting for a cannula to be put in. The medication hurt or made her feel very sick, but she knew she had to have it, so she never complained. When her fear of cannulas became too much, Gabs was able to choose between a PICC line or a port. It was hardly an everyday decision for a 10-year-old girl. I begged for psychological support for Gabs from day one, as I really realised the impact the situation would have on her. Unfortunately, Gabs had the wrong disease to qualify for psychological support. Luckily, she had already worked with the hospital CAMS team for her Tourette's syndrome, and they were allowed to help with the new fear of choking that Gabs developed. As the medication increased, Gabs's hair became thin and she lost a lot from underneath. Her steroids made her face swell and her body puff up. Gabs didn't recognise herself in the mirror. When Gabs went back to school, she couldn't join in with games outside, she couldn't go to the park without taking a wheelchair, and she couldn't go swimming or to swimming and trampoline parties. All she could do was join in by sitting down, but even that was impossible if her friends had a bunk bed. Her friend's parents had to be conscious of her PICC line, and I had to be on call the entire time. Gabs had no room to manoeuvre, someone always had to be with her. Buying clothes was so difficult because she was 2 sizes bigger and she didn't look like herself anymore, which led to a lot of body image issues. Gabs had weekly support from our local CAMS for 1.5 years. When they discharged her, I begged them not to, but they had no choice. Gabs did really well until she was told last year that her monthly infusions would stop. She then went into freefall as the safety net of GOSH was taken from her and she had to learn not to be the girl with JDM anymore. Gabs had never seen herself as a victim to JDM, but it had defined her life to some extent. I had to fight to get Gabs back into the CAMS system, and I'm really relieved to say she is now receiving the help she needs. Gabs is a wonderful straight A for effort student with the most incredible attitude and work ethic. She wanted to talk to you all, but she's currently in a video lesson for English. Gabs's mental health wasn't the only mental wellness affected. My son was 8 when Gabs was diagnosed. He went from having his mummy and sister at home to having to visit his sister in hospital, and mummy could only tuck him in via FaceTime every night. As soon as Gabs was admitted, I contacted my son's school and asked for counselling for him. They were amazing and implemented it straight away. It gave my son a safe space to explore his feelings, including his anger. Christmas 2015, Gabs and I had been allowed home for Christmas Day, and we were going back to GOSH on December the 27th. On the Boxing Day, my son turned to me and said, "We don't need you. You chose Gabs. I want Dad to divorce you." I was devastated, but completely understood where it came from. Even when Gabs was discharged, everything we did as a family still revolved around Gabs and JDM. We couldn't make plans for the weekend in case Gabs needed to rest. The first question anyone asked was, "How's Gabs?" My son was in the shadows. He and I have spent a long time rebuilding our relationship, and it is now better than ever, but I'm still very mindful that JDM affects him as much as Gabs. My relationship with my husband was also severely affected. We had very different experiences when I was in GOSH with Gabs. I was on the front line and he was holding the fort back home. It took us a long time to stop being Gabs's carers and start being a couple again. We forgot how to communicate or solve problems together because we had to get used to doing it apart. I'm delighted we've weathered the storm, but by no means has it been easy. As for my mental health, I too was refused psychological support in Gosh because Gabs didn't have the right disease and we were on the wrong ward. I knew that if I fell apart, then Gabs would fall apart. So I kept it together and we created a new life and routine at Gosh. But as soon as Gabs was discharged, I fell apart. We had returned home to a new normal, to a whole kitchen cupboard full of medication, including chemotherapy injections. And people kept saying, "What a relief, Gabs is well." No one understood that she wasn't clinically well. She was doing well because of taking several different medications a day, having 2 monthly infusions, and that our lives had changed completely. I got help for myself, but 4 years down the line, I still have vivid flashbacks and tears still flow without me realising. JDM is a hideous physical disease, but the impact on emotional well-being is actually worse, and it isn't treated at all. I think Gabs' story can be summed up by what a doctor said to her last year when Gabs explained how she was feeling mentally. "I don't understand why you feel like that. We've made you well."
Thank you, Lynn. And I think that brings us to the end, quite nicely in time. So I'll hand back over to you, Sue.
Yes, and thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lynn. It's hearing the direct experience of people, I think, really brings it home. And I can see a comment on the chat box making it clear how valuable a contribution that was. And also thank you very much, Polly, for taking the time today at this time to deliver that really interesting, useful presentation. We don't have a huge amount of time left for questions, but if there is anyone who with a burning question, now is the time to pop that in the Q&A box before we have to close this. So if we don't have any more questions, lots of thank yous coming in the chat box, which is great. If there aren't any questions, I'd just like to thank everybody who has managed to find the time to join us today. I hope you found it useful, and we will have the recording online so you can share that with colleagues if you want to. And another huge thank you to Lynn and Polly for making the time to join us today and to do such an effective and powerful presentation from both. Thank you very much.
Thank you.